This is Green Street, the environmental health show, greenstreetnews.org. Patti and Doug Wood and our worldwide network of scientists, medical professionals, reporters, authors, and others involved in environmental health, all here every week to keep you up to date on what you need to know to keep yourself and your family safe and healthy in this increasingly toxic world. Welcome back. The new administration in Washington has declared war on science. Grants are being eliminated, universities are being defunded, scientists working at government agencies are being fired, whole departments within our government agencies are being taken over by industry insiders with their own agendas, databases relied on by scientists around the world are being shut down, websites are being purged of data, and scientists who can see the writing on the wall are leaving the United States in record numbers. But this is not just impacting scientists and their families. It's going to eventually impact everyone in the world in a very negative way, as our knowledge about the world and ourselves takes major leaps backwards for the first time in history. Today on Green Street, we're delighted to welcome our friend Dr. Sandra Steingraber, who will talk about what this means for our future. Unless you live under a rock, you know that the world of science has taken a major hit from the Trump administration. Almost every newscast contains another story about some government agency or department or university research center whose funding has been cut in the name of efficiency or getting rid of waste, fraud, and abuse. But what are the long-term impacts of these dramatic cuts to our scientific community? Dr. Sandra Steingraber is an award-winning biologist, author, and the senior scientist for the Science and Environmental Health Network. Patti and I spoke with Dr. Steingraber this morning, and here's some of what she had to say about the war on science.
Well, I can look at this from a variety of viewpoints. You know, I was once a scientist who had grants to go off and do basic research. Currently, I serve as science in the public interest, which means I compile all the science that other people do and translate it into plain English and make it available to people in communities who need to know the science on a particular topic. Maybe they're fighting a pipeline. Maybe they have a toxic facility that's being planned for their community and they want to know how many kids will get asthma. And I can help them figure that out by doing the research for them. So I'm reliant on the science that gets done. And then also along the way, I have served on advisory committees, and I was once part of a group that worked with the Department of Defense, actually, in giving away taxpayer dollars to fund breast cancer research back in the Clinton administration days. So I've seen how that process works as well. So we can just start with the headlines of this week, I think, which is September 10th, a judge in the district court in D.C. ruled that the Trump administration can indeed go ahead and purge National Science Foundation grants worth over $1 billion. The scientists and their various associations had filed a legal challenge to those cuts, which happened sort of under the Elon Musk Doge early days of this administration. And they are pursuing redress of grievance through the courts and had asked that in the meantime, while their court case goes through, could we still have that money that was given to us by Congress? And the court just ruled, no, actually, you can't. So a lot of science that was in progress is now going to stop. And so that's just kind of the latest example across various agencies that include, you know, as you say, the Environmental Protection Agency, the National Institutes of Health, and so on. And so there are wide-ranging consequences for that, not only for basic science, but also for those of us who work sort of at the intersection between science and policy. So those of us who bring the science to our political decision makers to make rules and regulations or figure out what our policy should be about certain things, whether or not health insurance will pay for a colonoscopy under the age of 35, right? That depends on the science of colon cancer. And there's all kinds of things that listeners may not realize comes out of the National Science Foundation, which is now 75 years old. It's started in 1950 to kind of locate the United States as the world's leader in science. And like all of our knowledge about organ transplants, for example, comes out of research that was funded by the National Science Foundation. So if you're a person who has organ donor stamped on the back of your driver's license, know that the ability to harvest your organs and give them to somebody else and save lives after your death, that all came from basic work from an organization who's just got their completely devastated, right, in terms of the budget.
This is all being done under the guise of creating more efficiency, right? But it's
being
not
done right. It's just budget cuts.
Yeah,
right?
but that's not the only purpose here. Our only purpose is not just to save money.
Well, that's I mean, speaking of what they're claiming, right? They're claiming to save money, but it is, in fact, an existential threat to the practice of science altogether and an actual blow more largely to higher ed altogether. So it is possible to look at this as a kind of war on knowledge itself. But also, I just want to point out that American Sign Language is something that was created through National Science Foundation funding. And so the specific attack on the National Science Foundation was not only to just save money by cutting the budget, but also, remember, to get rid of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yep.
So there were grants very specifically targeted so that people who can participate in the scientific process aren't just white men, that they're given to women, they're given to minorities, they're given to disabled people. So you might wonder, okay, too bad for the disabled people, but the reason that science can be so brilliant and solve so many different problems is when we have a diversity of brains bringing their own lived experience to bear. So you can't fund research on American Sign Language unless you include the community of the hard of hearing and the deaf, right? So This is why DEI is really important, and the kind of research that the NSF funds is meaningful to our lives.
Wow. Okay. So are private foundations stepping up and continuing to fund, like, for instance, longitudinal studies, which are so critical in many cases?
Yeah, well, private foundation money and industry money isn't really designed to do these big, as you say, the longitudinal studies, these big long-term studies where we're just monitoring things, right? We might have satellites in the sky that are monitoring greenhouse gases. We may be collecting long-term data on birth defects to see what the trends are, or breast cancer to see what the trends are. There's a long-term study that's been going on for 30 years that looks at farmers exposed to pesticides, both in North Carolina and in Iowa. That was through the EPA. And so there's no way that we can all race for the cure and wear pink ribbons and make up all of what had been public funds that aren't just going to disappear tomorrow, that can not only pay for the salaries of the people who collect the data, but all the infrastructure that's needed, right? So in some cases, these longitudinal studies rely on maintaining populations of genetically identical frogs for years and years and generations, or breast cancer cell lines that have to be maintained in petri dishes and held in certain, temperatures and conditions. So there has to be money to just keep the lights turned on in the places that are doing. Another example is all the Drosophila work. Drosophila are fruit flies. And it turns out that thanks to public funding, we have determined the entire genome of a fruit fly, and they actually share quite a lot of genes with us, and they have very short generation times. You keep fruit flies alive in the lab pretty easily. But you need to maintain populations that have exactly the genetics you want, right? So there's actually this big collaboration among a bunch of universities, University of New Mexico, University of Cambridge in England, I think Harvard, I think Indiana universities, all involved in this big, what's called the fly base, which is an entire database of fruit flies. And so anybody who wants to do research, for example, there was recently a research project looking at the impact of sleep deprivation on health. Well, they started with fruit flies. And so all that database just got cut. So, there will be long-term consequences of that. Another database that I use on a daily basis, well, on a regular basis, is from part of the NIH called the National Institutes for Occupational Safety and Health, the FOG database, which is fatalities among oil and gas industry workers. That's now frozen or dead. So we were looking all the time to see, since I do research on fracking, to see what's going on with workers in the field, because oftentimes they're the canaries in the coal mine. Like, I'm interested in thinking about health impacts on people, pregnant women, old people, children who live near fracking sites. But the first place to go is to take a look at what's happening to the workers. And a lot of them are having heart attacks at very young ages, right? That very healthy young men dropping dead on the job site from so-called heart attacks. So that used to be, all documented in the FOG database. That gives us clues that whatever's coming out of fracking sites may be cardiotoxic. And then we can go look, for example, and we see, if you look at Medicare databases in Pennsylvania, older people who live near fracking sites are at higher risk for certain kinds of cardiac events. But without the worker data, which is important in its on its own merits, but it also gives us clues for the larger population. So that's one, the FOG database is one database that's now gone that I myself relied on for my own research.
So I have to ask, and I was hinting at this before, the influence of industry over the kinds of cuts that are being made, or do you feel that it's just across the board without regard to whose industry is involved?
Well, I don't know what kind of machinations are happening behind the scene, but what I can say historically is that there was a time before the National Science Foundation, before these big investments in public science with public taxpayer dollars, which is really kind of a Cold War project, right? After World War II, the US participated in all kinds of the race to the space, with the Soviets being one, but also it just emerged as a scientific superpower. That's what we felt we could lead the world in doing. And so prior to that, a lot of basic research was funded by industry, right? And you see, looking back, the effects of that. The lead paint industry dominated the funding of research on the impacts on children's health of exposure to lead paint. And so for 50 years, between 1920 and 1970 or so, the industry kind of held sway in that world. And they ended up saying wild things, like it's not lead that makes kids stupid, it's that stupid kids eat lead paint, right? So, and they design studies, what we call inconclusive by design, right? So you design a study with a sample size and a statistical way of analyzing the data, that there's no way, even if there's a really egregious health harms, that it's going to show up in the data. And of course, the one that's probably more familiar to listeners is the tobacco story. Like the tobacco industry used to do a lot of basic research on the impacts of tobacco. They had monkeys and mice smoking cigarettes in cages, and so it always showed no harm, right? And it really wasn't until there was a public investment in objective science from the federal government that we made the connection between smoking and lung cancer, and we made this connection between lead paint exposure and destroying the brains of kids. So before federal funding, we couldn't really demonstrate all that.
All right, so NSF has been kind of the gold standard, actually internationally, right? I mean, globally, that's where, a lot of other countries are getting
Correct.
their
like our databases are being used all around the world, right? Yeah,
exactly. So they're actually making policy using our research. So my question is, have other countries stepped up? I know that I read about France. Do you have a handle on what's going on in the rest of the world, the rest of the scientific research world?
Well, we're definitely seeing a brain drain among U.S. scientists. So some of our most accomplished and finest scientists are simply leaving for Europe or Canada.
Yeah.
And in fact, there's a recent survey of scientists, and 75% of U.S. scientists said they were considering leaving the country. So that was shocking to me. Already there have been, I think, 70,000 scientific jobs lost. So all of those federal scientists are now looking for work, and some of them are going to industry, and some of them are going abroad.
Wow. But it's not going to happen that these other countries will develop the databases that they used to get from the United States. I mean, those are not things that you can create overnight, right? I mean, there's going to be a long gap now in our knowledge base because...
Yeah, totally correct. Yeah.
And how long do you think that's going to go on? And do you have hope that it will recover?
Well, when you destroy the infrastructure of something, it can't just bounce back, right? And so, I mean, we're all looking right now at these satellites that are collecting climate data. They're maybe going to be destroyed. And so are we going to just turn around after the next election and put two more really expensive satellites up in the sky? I don't think so. And also remember that science is such a collaborative process that it relies on training the next generation of scientists. And the people who are being hit the hardest right now, as far as I can see, are graduate students and postdoctoral fellows who are the new up-and-coming scientists who rely, oftentimes they're paying their rent and buying their groceries entirely on the grant money that the principal investigator has brought in. And so without them, we just don't have any new scientists coming up. So the brain drain is not just represented by the number of scientists who have lost their grant and lost their jobs, but also on the inability to train the next generation of scientists, and then by the destruction of, the laboratories where the cell cultures are being grown and reproduced very carefully for a half century or more, so that when if we get really interested in a question about what's the impact of the exposure of this toxic chemical, we can go to a certain fish that we've been growing carefully in the lab that is this same fish that they used 25 years ago, and then we can make comparisons, right? Mm-hmm. And so if we let those aquariums, if we're not funding the sort of overhead that takes just to keep all the frogs alive and the mice alive and the cell culture lines alive and the satellites up in the sky, it's not like we can just turn around with a new administration and bring all that back. It's just gone.
Sure. And I wonder about, young men and women in high school who are thinking about careers and,
right.
Maybe it's going to be science or finance, and they decide, well, science is not a viable path anymore. And then we're going to lose. Now we've lost not only our databases, but we're going to have a big gap in
the generation, right?
Yeah. So how do you sleep at night? Are you optimistic about the future of science? I mean, how do you think about this in, writ large?
Oh, in the core of my being is this kind of punk who is absolutely determined to go forward. And I am aware of a couple of things from my own autobiography that I bring to my work every day. One is that I survived a rare cancer when I was 20 and had to get into a research library and find out what was in my drinking water aquifers, and ended up writing a book about it. It became a documentary film, the cancer cluster in my hometown and the carcinogens in the drinking water that there was a big kind of cover up around. So that's who I am. And I'm also the adopted daughter of a German American. I wear my adopted father's name fairly proudly, Steingraber. He was a German American who was sent at age 18 to fight against the German Panzer tanks and played a role in the liberation of Europe, and felt that that was his greatest accomplishment, even though it gave him PTSD. I mean, we didn't have a name for that then. He really struggled with emotional regulation. But when my dad was sent over as a teenager, it didn't look good for us. Yeah. I mean, there were some terrible losses at the hands of these German Panzer tanks. But the idea is that you have to do the right thing no matter what the circumstances are. And for my father, playing a role in defeating fascism meant that, if you're called to do that, you just do it, no matter what the odds look like. So I kind of take that as my ethos, right? So that I will always be a warrior for science. I'm aware that as an adopted person who was denied knowledge of my own ancestry, my own parentage, I don't have a legal birth certificate. That makes me feel aligned with all the other people in the world who are told they don't belong. And it also, I'm active in the adoptee rights movement, trying to make adoption records available to us and get rid of all the secrecy and deception in the adoption practice. But I also bring that same perspective to my work as a scientist, meaning that there needs to be right to know about toxic databases. People that are harmed have not only the right to know, but the duty to inquire. Mm-hmm. And I am interested in helping communities provide them tools so that they can inquire and get information. And so I'm very glad to be working with Science and Environmental Health Network, because we are a little shop of attorneys and scientists who can provide communities with legal tools and good science so that they can make good decisions about environmental projects that are industrial projects or pesticides or a data center that's planned for their community. Like, we can provide information. So I'm a scientist for the people. So a community tells me what they want answers to, and I go out and research it for them. But I can't do my work unless the basic science is funded and I have access to those results. including, as Patti mentioned, these long-term longitudinal studies, which show us what the trends are. I mean, there's just so many things when I go through and find out what's being cut and what we're losing. I mean, we're talking about not like funding that asks what is going on with tobacco use among Gen Z, right? What do we know about mental health in teenagers? I mean, all of that is stuff that is, if you think you know anything about that, or you read something or you heard something on the radio, it's because of research that was funded by our taxpayer dollars. Like, what should you do if you think you're having a stroke? Right? That's all things that were figured out through massive public investment, through the agencies that we're talking about. And people use it every day.
Dr. Sandra Steingraber, award-winning biologist, author, and the senior scientist for the Science and Environmental Health Network, talking about the Trump administration's war on science. You can learn more about Dr. Steingraber and her work at our program website, greenstreetnews.org. That's going to do it for this edition of Green Street. Patti and I will be back next week with another edition of the show. Thanks for listening.